have a, before I get to the actual reading today, so please bear with me. We've completed some time with Paul's letter to the Ephesians, and we're going to spend the next few weeks on the book of James. And before we start our reading today, it behooves us to learn a little bit more about the book and its author before we begin this journey through the book of James. First, there are two persons named James who are major figures in the New Testament. One is James, the son of Zebedee, one of my favorite names of the Bible, Zebedee. Since he was martyred in the year 44 by Herod Agrippa, and dates of things in the book come after that, we can eliminate him as being the author of the book of James. The second James is the brother of Jesus. Turns out James, the brother of Jesus, is the most likely the James of this book. Interestingly, this James was a leader in Jerusalem from about 36 until his martyrdom in 62. He played a prominent role in a debate over the conditions under which non-Jews were to be considered eligible to be members of the church. Our current debates, for example, about sexual expression in the church and role of women in the church, could learn from this debate of the early founders of the church as they struggled with this historic and biblical interpretation. Their struggle being the decision to welcome or not we, the Gentiles, into the church without first becoming the equivalent of being a Jewish person and following all the laws of the Torah. It was an unprecedented move away from the literal interpretation of the text to the discernment of the intent of the Lord. It's covered in the book of Acts, chapter 14, if you want to check it out. But anyway, back to the book of James. Unlike many of Paul's letters, James is not addressed to a specific church. It is instead, it appears to be a general open letter written to numerous churches where it would have been read in that day. It adopts a style of instructional speech characteristic of the Greco-Roman ethical teaching. It's a style called diatribe. Now, we tend to think of diatribe in a negative or pejorative sense, but here we need to recognize it's more of a formal style of rhetoric, of persuasive speech. The style involves questions from imaginary opponents, words attributed to particular characters, as well as rapid-fire questions and answers. Another feature of the diatribe style involves dense use of metaphors. And all this can make the language particularly challenging to us. One final comment. This book is closer to the wisdom literature of the Bible, like Proverbs in the Old Testament, than it is to the epistles or the letters of the New Testament. James reads like a collection of saying and teachings for developing a community of Christ followers, a community hoping to distinguish themselves from the world by how they live together. We will find as we move through James, the book does not hold back on diagnosing the death-dealing ways of the world for the poison that they are. This wisdom literature from James remains both prophetic and provocative. Note, this book is not always held in high esteem by church leaders. Martin Luther, great reformer, called James the epistle of straw. He did this because of the book's emphasis on works rather than reliance on faith in salvation. James does not defy the role of grace in salvation. James has a different companion message for us to hear beyond we are saved by our faith. Now, one commentary pointed out that particularly struck me is that the lectionary we're going to read today, in it the editors do not always make the most helpful choices. She says the reading today are James chapter 1, 17 to 22. demonstrates this rather cleanly and clearly. Rather than selecting one argument, the passage actually contains at least three different arguments. However, this reading does serve both as a precursor to the rest of the letter and a succinct exposition of what James calls pure and undefined religion. So let us, as we listen to James chapter 1, 17 to 22, begin our journey towards this pure and undefiled religion. Every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creatures. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Therefore, rid yourselves of all the sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. Be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and, on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and will persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act. They will be blessed in their doing. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to take care for the orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. The word of God. Let's be to God. Let's look at some of the parts of this text in a little bit more detail. In the first verse of our reading, with its deep metaphorical language, we can decode it to learn that God is generous with the gift of truth. We also learn that this is a gift of wisdom intended so that we can be his first fruits. It tells us that wisdom is not hidden. You do not need a decoder. You do not need any secret ring for interpreting the messages. If we truly desire to be wise, wisdom from God will come from another plane, come down from the Father, to help us create an alternative community of care in this world. We are told that this is an unchanging wisdom. It says it has no variation or shadow due to change. If we absorb this wisdom and allow it to take root in us, we will be more and better equipped. We will be prepared to resist the passions of the world that disrupt us as individuals and as our community. Both individuals and community are important to James. As Ron Allen states in the Preacher's Bible Handbook, the intent of James is to call to mind a way of life together for God's purposes. Even when many instructions seem to be directed towards individuals, God is building the faith community. James in this segment is giving kind of a preamble to his whole book. Almost all parts of this next verses can and have been used for full sermons many times. He will come back to some of these themes in later chapters. But for now, I would ask you, as a way of summarizing, that you do a visualization exercise with me. As you are driving north on US 23, You just passed Radnor Road on your left. What do you see on your right? Some of you will think about the series of signs that leads up to Mom's sausage, right? But I'm going to ask you to visualize the signs that say, sign 1 says, you must understand this. Sign 2, let everyone be. Sign 3, quick to listen. 4, slow to speak. 5, slow to anger. Finally, the last sign, James 1:19. So you got that in your head now. Next time you go north on 23. Quick to listen, slow to anger, slow to speak. James gives us advice as current today as it was in the first century. James counsels the value of listening and keeping a cool head. He does not counsel these traits as only ends in themselves. He counsels because their opposite does not produce God's justice or righteousness. Note, James does not warn against all speech or anger, but rather against character trait that has one speak too quickly or is too easily angered. Instead of these character traits, James would say to Christians in more contemporary language, lead with your eye, with your ears, follow with your tongue, and let anger straggle along in the rear. God's righteousness doesn't grow from human anger. So throw all the spoiled virtue and cancerous evil in the garbage. In simple humility, let our gardener, God, landscape you with the word, making a salvation garden of your life. Well, moving ahead in our text, the second portion of the lectionary begins James' focus on communication. We will hear more on this. It explores the connection between how we communicate and our faithfulness to God. Although James lived in almost a totally verbal society, for us, we should not miss the opportunity to expand on this with other forms of communication. Be they verbal, be they on paper, be they even virtual, when we communicate through email and Twitter and all our electronic means. Communications was a challenge in biblical times. It is a challenge today. We just have more means to communicate and miscommunicate as well. Well, the third part of our text picks up on the theme of how that will be repeated in next week's reading, the importance of faith-informed action. Faithful action for James means paying specific attention to the law of liberty. Now, commentaries tell us that the law of liberty, yet another metaphor, is a shorthand for Torah, or the Old Testament law, especially the 10 Commandments, and for one other verse from the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:18. Yeah, I had to look that one up too. It is, you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Believers need to put this law of liberty into action rather than just listen to it. This is to be done with intention. This is not something where you can just look in a mirror and walk away not remembering, not taking into account your own reflection. Here, the contrast between those who look in the mirror and forget, and those who truly look into the law and remember. A contrast between seeing things as one wishes and seeing things as God wishes. James seems to wrap up this introduction with his version of something like the two memorable phrases of what we call the greatest commandment from Jesus. Remember Matthew 22, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. James' version, in more very metaphorical language, remember his diatribe style, defines true religion. Defining true religion, first what it is not, and then what it is. Not true religion. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Said in another helpful translation, anyone who sets himself up as religious by talking a good game is self-deceived. This is a kind of religion is hot air and only hot air. They're talking a good game, hot air, metaphors galore, but hopefully you get the idea of the not true religion. Then what is true religion? James has two metaphors here. First, religion that is pure is this, to take care for orphans and widows in their distress. Now, please understand, this is not just about orphans and widows. In James' time, you could not get any lower on the social order than orphans and widows. In this statement of inclusion of all, care for all humanity is the focus, even those as low as orphans and widows. The second metaphor for religion that is pure is to keep oneself unstained by the world. As Tony Evans says in his commentary, practice in the world, but not of the world religion. That is, in your conduct, keep yourself unstained. Don't let the world rub off on you. Instead, rub off on the world and leave behind a trace of grace. This summons to avoid self-deception and practice genuine piety sets the tone for the rest of the letter of James. Over the next few weeks, we will spend some time on the message of the book of James and the wisdom of James. I hope that this morning we have laid a foundation for exploring deeper, exploring this religion that is pure and undefiled before God. This religion that asks us to care for the orphans and the widows and asks us to keep ourselves unstained by the world. May it be so. Amen.